McKenzie, we don't hear you.
Sorry about that. Thank you. We'll get this started again. Now, any other technical problems, I'm the first one who had them. So my name is McKenzie. Welcome to Stony Brook Southampton's Writers Speak Wednesday series. My name is McKenzie, and I have the pleasure of introducing our wonderful writer for this evening. In an interview published in the Fiction Writers Review, Margot Livesey said she is acutely interested in those moments when the boundaries between various realities vanished. In her work, this interest manifests into complex characters who are always on the cusp, their realities protected by a membrane so thin it is sure to burst with just a little narrative push. It is a joy to read as her characters' lives and perspectives intersect. Though she now teaches at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop, she was raised in the Scottish Highlands. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Guggenheim and NEA fellowships. Her writing career boasts a collection of short stories, 8 novels, and a book of essays on writing titled The Hidden Machinery. In the wake of these essays on craft, Margot wrote her most recent novel, The Boy in the Field. In discussion of The Boy in the Field, author Mari Coates calls Margot a master of thin spaces, the places where life slips from one reality into another. It is my pleasure to welcome Margot Livesey to our Writers Speak Wednesday series. Margot, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, McKenzie, and many thanks to Frank for getting us on the screen, and to my dear friend, the wonderful Paul Harding, for inviting me. I think I've read every word that Paul has written, and I can't wait to read more. He's one of those indispensable writers. I'm going to read 2 short sections from my most recent novel, The Boy in the Field. The first is the opening section, so I don't need to do that difficult thing of explain anything to you. And you'll see me using a grown-up, omniscient voice, which I've long wanted to do. The Boy in the Field. The Field. Here is what happened one Monday in the month of September in the last year of the last century. Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan Lang were on their way home from school. Usually they took the bus from the larger town where they attended secondary school to the smaller town where they lived. But that morning their father had said he had an errand to run and would collect them. So they waited beside the school gates and watched the bus depart. After 15 minutes, with no sign of the familiar car, they began to walk along the road that led to their town. They each wore a version of the school uniform, a white shirt, black trousers, and a black pullover. Expecting their father to appear at any moment, they walked fast, making it a game to see how far they could get before he pulled up beside them. They left the last houses behind. Hawthorn hedges and an occasional ash tree hid the fields that bordered the road. Through one gate, they saw a herd of cows, through another, rows of barley. The afternoon was warm and still. Only a few leaves fringed with brown hinted at autumn. Zoe was the one who spotted something through the hedge. She had a gift for finding things: birds' nests, their mother's calculator, a missing book, a secret. "What's that?" she demanded, stooping to peer through the tangled branches. The flash of red could have been poppies bordering the field, but the poppies had already lost their petals. Before her brothers could answer, Zoe turned and ran back to the gate they had just passed. Matthew and Duncan watched her go. Zoe brought her knees high and pumped her arms. Last sports day, she had won the quarter mile by almost 3 seconds. As she reached the gate, Duncan, without a word, took off after her. A car sped by, the smooth engine noise undercut by a harsh rattle. Matthew looked at the sky, mostly blue with a fortress of cumulus clouds in the east, and gave up on being the responsible one who waited for their father. The two bags, his and Zoe's, banged against the metal bars of the gate as he climbed over and jumped down onto the rutted ground. The field had recently been harvested, and circular bales of straw lay randomly across the dull gold stubble. In the middle of the field stood a magnificent oak tree in full leaf. Matthew caught up with first Duncan, then Zoe. From a distance, it was still possible to believe that the boy was asleep, lying on the grassy border between hedge and stubble. Christ, whispered Zoe. The closer they got to him, the slower they walked. None of them spoke. Glinting bluebottles and smaller flies circled the boy. His hair was dark, his skin very pale. He wore a deep blue shirt, a colour Duncan would later call cobalt, black shorts, and what appeared to be long red socks. At the local private school, the younger boys wore bright red knee socks, and for the briefest instant Zoe thought, oh, he's in uniform. A few steps closer and she grasped the nature of the red. His eyelids were pale with a delicate tracery of veins. Everything that happened, they all three later agreed, was only possible because of those closed eyelids. The boy's chest rose fractionally and fell fractionally. With no one to tell them what to feel, they did not cry out or exclaim. Zoe tiptoed forward, knelt down at a cautious distance, and leaned over to touch the boy's bare arm where it emerged below the shirt sleeve. His skin was reassuringly warm. He was a little older than her, 18, perhaps 19. We need to get help, she said. But she was not going anywhere. She was gently stroking the boy's bare arm. Except for his clothes and his scarlet legs, Matthew thought, the boy could have been an illustration in a Victorian novel. The weary harvester, rest after toil, the dreaming poet. He told Duncan to go back to the road and stop a car. Tell the driver someone's hurt, Matthew said. He needs an ambulance. I will stop there and jump forward about 50 pages. Each of the teenagers, each of the children has a kind of guide in the novel. And I wanted to read a short section where Duncan, the youngest, he's 13, finds his guide. As a boy of 4 or 5, Duncan was attacked by an Alsatian, Leo, and in response to this, his family got their first dog, a dachshund, Arthur, who was for Duncan an essential member of the family, and Arthur died that spring, and Duncan is now insisting they get a new dog. He gets his father to take him to the shelter, but the shelter is problematic because how can he choose one dog rather than another? What happens to all the dogs he leaves behind? So they leave the shelter without a dog, and this is what happens next. Duncan was leaving the newsagent's, his new pencils paid for and in a bag, when he saw the card in the window, a drawing of a dog, black with large eyes and large paws, nicely done by someone not particularly skilled. Good dog free to good home. No phone number, but an address Duncan knew not far away. He wrote the house number on the palm of his hand. As he walked down first one street, then another, he tried not to be hopeful. Who would get rid of a dog if it didn't have a problem? He wished he could put into words what he was looking for. Not size or age or breed, apart from no Alsatians, no Dachshunds, but some kind of emanation. At the sight of the house, Duncan checked his palm, hoping he'd got the number wrong. The front garden was thick with weeds. Moss grew between the bricks around the door. Pea-green curtains sagged in the windows. Remembering the drawing, Duncan pushed open the gate. The doorbell, when he pressed it, was dead. He knocked twice. He was bending to move a snail off the path when he heard the latch turn. Two slender feet, clad in black socks, occupied the threshold. "Hey," said a voice. A boy, a little older than Matthew, was regarding Duncan with an open gaze. "Hey." Duncan set the snail down among the weeds. "I saw your notice in the newsagents about the good dog." Something changed in the boy's expression. Had the dog already gone? "I don't mean to be rude," he said, "but is this okay with your mum and dad? Not everyone likes dogs." "It's definitely okay." He explained about Arthur and the failed visit to the animal rescue. "Why don't you want your dog anymore?" "I'm going to London," the boy said. "I can't take care of Lily as well as myself. She needs company, regular walks." Lily, thought Duncan. The boy opened the door wide and led the way down a corridor. In the kitchen, a black dog, bigger than Arthur, smaller than Leo, was sitting on a tattered red rug, her front paws, not especially large, neatly together. Duncan knelt down a couple of yards away and held out his hand. Her coat was sleek, like that of a black Labrador, but her ears were pricked like those of a corgi, only smaller. She studied him for a few seconds. Then she stood up and walked towards him, taking him in with her dark eyes. She was not a puppy, but still young. She sniffed his hand, sat down, and held up her right paw. The invitation was clear. Duncan felt the rough pads, the prick of nails. Lily emanated. "She likes you," said the boy, "and you seem to like her." "How old is she?" Duncan squeezed her paw gently and released it. "I don't know. She's an orphan. One night last Christmas I came home and she was curled up on the doorstep shivering. She was so small she'd squeezed under the garden gate. I brought her in and fed her, and in the morning I went up and down the street asking if anyone had lost a puppy. I put up notices. No one responded, so I decided she'd claimed me. Now she's claiming you." He squatted down beside Duncan. Lily pressed her head against his knee. "I'd keep you if I could," the boy said. Her dark eyes understood and forgave. I will stop there in the hope that you will ask me questions, which I think you can do using the chat function, using the Q&A function. But I would welcome a discussion with all of you and with McKenzie. Oh, I can't hear you, McKenzie.
Thank you so much for that wonderful reading of your most recent novel. And yes, anybody watching on YouTube, you can drop your questions into the chat and I will relay them to Margot. I'll get us started while you type up your questions. So as I was reading The Boy in the Field, I took note that the events are instigated by a moment of violence. And lately I've been thinking, with our national context and everything, how to best handle violence in writing. And I'm curious how you think about violence in your own writing and in writing in general, and what you think about that.
What a great question, McKenzie. I do have violence in my writing, but not graphic violence. And I made a number of decisions about The Boy in the Field. One was that I feel that there are an awful lot of novels that begin with someone finding the body of a young woman, and I really didn't want to write that novel, so I made it a young man, and his injuries turn out not to be fatal. He does recover. So I was very conscious of trying to subvert certain tropes, certain what I would call cliches. At the same time, I wanted the violence to be unmistakable, and the novel is really about the aftermath of violence and how it propels Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan, and also the boy himself in various directions. And I began the novel shortly after the person whose name we're never going to say again was elected in 2016, and I was in certain ways very much writing against that, against all that seemed to be going on. At the same time, I think it's really important to write about violence, that it plays such a huge role in human events, but the violence can be at so many levels. It can be psychic, it can be physical, it can be national, it can be systemic. I think the last 4 years have been an education into many different kinds of violence.
Thank you so much for that wonderful answer. That I asked you that because I thought the violence was handled so delicately and so beautifully in this book. So along with many congratulations in the chat, we have a question from one of our students named Felix. He writes, "A color Duncan would later call cobalt. Such specificity with time, perspective, and detail. Was this line written with this sense of time in mind initially, or edited as part of a later draft?"
Felix, I wish I could say that it sprang onto the page fully formed, but I did spend a good deal of time revising the opening section to try to simultaneously create a sense of real immediacy, that the children are in the field now, and also a sense that they are looking back, or they will be looking back. Duncan is an artist, a visual artist, and he's very aware of colors. So his use of the word cobalt is an early signal of his devotion to precise colors, if you will. And one of my aesthetic ambitions for The Boy in the Field was to write a short novel in which a lot happened. And so in the opening chapter, I was trying to set up that sense of perspective, even as I was trying to spiral down into the characters.
Thank you, Margot. We have another question, this one coming from Paul. He asks, can you describe the pleasures and pains, power and complications of using an omniscient point of view, generally and in this particular narrative's measured, understated tone and pace?
Is this Paul Harding?
Yes.
Yes, I thought it must be because of the beautiful cadences of the question. And well, I'd long wanted to write in the omniscient point of view ever since I was at the Warren Wilson Low Residency MFA program. And, excuse me, and Rick Russo gave a wonderful lecture about omniscience and about the power of the omniscient voice when used correctly. And growing up reading many Victorian novels, of course, I loved that voice. But whenever I tried to use it, I felt it sort of going awry, that I go unbalancing, if you will. And in this novel, it felt really crucial to begin in the omniscient point of view, to suggest that there was a narrator hovering over all the events. And later chapters, they're not even chapters really, later sections alternate between the three siblings and are written in the close third point of view. And that felt crucial as well, because I wanted to suggest how every member of a family is having a different experience of that family, that you're sleeping under the same roof, you're sitting around the same table, but your experiences are very different, very singular, if you will. And so just as I'd fallen in love with the omniscient point of view, I had to abandon it for the close third.
Yes, as I was reading your novel, I noticed all the characters were almost like in Venn diagrams, where they shared some information and then some information was in their own circle and everything was overlapped. And yeah, I appreciate that in the challenges of omniscience. In the chat from Lori Jones, along with a thank you for coming, she asks, we just read your essay on Virginia Woolf. Is she one of your favorites? What inspired you to analyze her process, and how does that impact your writing?
Thank you, Laurie, for asking about Virginia. I think she's become an increasingly important figure in my life. At the time that I studied at university, she was really regarded as a minor writer. My supervisor, I was forgetting the term, had written a book on Virginia Woolf, and it was regarded as a very kind of minor endeavor. But that didn't stop me reading and loving her work. And I think what I've come to value increasingly over time, and becoming better acquainted with her enormous output, is the way in which she really struggled to articulate an aesthetic. And that was something that I just hadn't thought to do as a young writer. I wanted to try to write. I knew there were some stories and books I loved, and I thought if I just tried to emulate them in some way, maybe I could write something. But Woolf suggested the importance of writing towards something and against something, and the degree to which all writers are in conversation. There's a wonderful story about, and Paul, you might have to correct me here, there's a wonderful story about the Russian poet Akhmatova in the queue at the famous prison. I'm forgetting the name of the prison. And a woman in the queue recognizes Akhmatova and asks her, could you write about this? Could you write about this in your poem? And Martova says, yes, I think I could. And I think of writers, that we're all sort of writing together in a way. We're all part of this queue, of this communal experience, even while we're trying to make something very individual.
Thank you, Margot. As I was reading your Virginia Woolf essay myself, I was really struck by the questions that you ask for young writers to develop their own aesthetic. And I was wondering, one that really struck me was, what is new in the world that we need to capture in our novels and stories? And I don't know if you could share what's on your mind right now about what in this world is new that needs to be captured.
I think things are shifting all the time, and I think there's still a very large gap between the experience of reading most fiction and the experiences that we are having every day as we go about our lives, and that fiction is still struggling to close that gap. I mean, Stream of Consciousness was an attempt to close that gap, and modernism was an attempt to close that gap, and postmodernism was another attempt. And I think, a few things that come to mind are the radically different ways in which children are treated nowadays, over the last 30, 40 years, the shifting relationships between and among the sexes, the role of technology in our lives, and how that has altered intimacy in complicated ways that we're still trying to figure out. The sense of being connected in a much more global way, which is something the pandemic has only made clearer. The growing understanding of systemic racism. I was talking to my friend Gish Jen today, and she was describing how when her daughter was small, she had a German au pair, and when the three of them went out together, people would assume that her daughter, that Gish was the au pair, and that So anyway, I just think there's we're very fortunate that there are so many things to write about, so much subject matter.
Yes, all this new subject matter, no small task. Another question from the chat from Laura. Laura writes, authors often say their characters surprised them as they were writing. The characters we have met tonight are all young. Were they capable of surprising you?
I have about 10 different things to say. First, I think of Nabokov, who said his characters were his servants, and give up on this rubbish about surprising them. They would just do what he told them. But I did and do love writing about younger characters, because I think they have a curiosity and a sense of moral purpose that often gets dulled in older characters. I mean, for me, when I was being a child, was like acting out King Lear every day. I mean, I had all the passions, but I didn't necessarily have the vocabulary. And I think that many teenagers are much more interested in questions of philosophy, religion, existentialism, politics. Greta Thunberg is amazing, but she's not alone. So I didn't see writing about younger characters as a diminution. If anything, I saw it as as a particularly wonderful opportunity to do things that I sometimes can't do with my older characters. And yes, they were capable of surprising me. My characters are not good servants.
Oh, to return to the curiosity and moral purpose of childhood, right? So Kathleen writes, thank you for the lovely reading. Can you please talk about your wonderful ability to maintain tension and pacing in this novel?
Such a complimentary question. Thank you. I had an idea for the novel, which came from the initial finding of a body came from a story told to me a number of years ago by an acquaintance. And I had it in mind to somehow tell this story and how it. Let me reverse out of that for a moment. One of the things that really interests me is what happens when people's lives jump the tracks, if you will. Your life is on course A, B, C, and suddenly you jump to G, or you go back to A. And I think that's a very interesting moment. I have that in my own life. Everyone I grew up with is still in Scotland or still in Britain. I'm the only person I know who spends a great deal of time in the States. My life jumped the tracks, as it were. It didn't follow the expected course. And so one of my ambitions for Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan was to show that process for each of them. And I wrote the novel moving between them. I didn't alternate the points of view in any conscious way. I was always following an underlying story, a story that I saw running below the three narratives, if you will. And I was also consciously subverting the genre of the detective story, if you will. I think one of the things that people like about detective stories is something violent happens. It creates disorder, and the detective, the woman or man of virtue, goes down into the valley of shadow and brings back order, creates order again. And I think that's why people find detective stories very comforting. So underneath what happens to the three Langs is a detective story with a detective struggling to solve a crime. And I think that's one of the things that helps to make the novel more suspenseful, that there is a kind of urgency. I don't think exactly a clock ticking, but something that resembles a clock.
Thank you, Margot. So now a question I have from the other side of your life and work, teaching at the Iowa Writers Workshop. What advice do you have for those of us who are interested in teaching writing, who do teach writers? What advice do you have for that?
Gosh, I feel Paul should be answering this question, or we should be answering it together. I think that I spent my 20s mostly working in restaurants and cafes and dry cleaners, a shop, a pharmaceutical factory. And when I discovered teaching, when I discovered that someone would let me teach, which seemed pretty amazing, I found it both very overwhelming and very interesting. I loved being able to go into a classroom and talk about Chekhov as opposed to asking people how they wanted their steaks done. But at the same time, there was a danger of it completely taking over my consciousness, that my students and their wonderful work would colonize my life, my writing life. So I think what I've struggled to do as I've got older is to teach very wholeheartedly, but always to be sure when I'm teaching that I'm writing. I try to write every day when I'm teaching. I don't always manage it, but I try to keep contact with my own work and to come into the classroom every day as a writer, as someone facing the open page and struggling with the open page. And I hope that makes me more empathetic to my students and their wonderful work, rather than less.
Well, thank you so much for your time this evening. It has been an absolute delight to hear you read and then get your wisdom on writing and reading in the greater sense. Is there anything else you would like to share this evening before we conclude our program?
I think the thing that made the biggest difference to me as a young writer was discovering the incredibly obvious thing of revision. When I first started writing, I didn't realize what a very large role revision played or could play, and how I could take something really quite mediocre and make it better. So when I'm struggling to write first drafts, I'm always trying to tolerate my own mediocrity and believing in the optimism of revision, believing I really can make something better. So there are a few writers I know, very few, who write things. Tessa Hadley, the British writer, is like this. She writes 500 words a day. And at the end, basically, the book is done. But I think she's a very rare exception, and most people are more like me in really having to first make the clay, as it were, and then shape the clay into a beautiful vase.
Well, we have a chorus of thank yous in the comments, and I'd like to add my voice to that chorus. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It has been an absolute pleasure. We hope those of you watching will join us for more of the Writers Speak Wednesdays. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Thank you, McKenzie, and everyone, and good luck. May the muse attend you.